Founder of Something or Other Publishing, Wade Franson, is the host of Created in the Image of God, a series that examines the role of religion in society, from messianic returns to the emotive responses transmitted through our culture. Wade fearlessly addresses reality claims from all directions, objectively exploring their compatibility with Holy Scripture. Joining him is Daniel Sanderson, CEO of Planksip, an international philosophy and cultural media outlet, helping emerging thought leaders with personal branding by co-creating organic content. Tonight's episode, Paul Within Islam, with Caleb Gilleland.
The purpose of this show was to pre-record. So we have Caleb all the way from Scotland, and the purpose of this show was to pre-record it just simply because of the time difference. And in typical fashion, the format of the show does not change. We're going to spend a little bit of time finding out a little bit about your background, how you grew up, and a little bit about your journey. So, Caleb, why don't you tell me and the audience a little bit about your formative years, your childhood, where you grew up, and what your childhood was like.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on, and I also appreciate the fact that it's quite early where y'all are, and not nearly as early here. So I grew up in Georgia, so kind of North Georgia, I guess like an hour and a half away from Atlanta. And back then, not to completely date myself, Atlanta wasn't nearly as big as it was now. I mean, Atlanta gains about 1 million people extra every decade. So when I was a kid, it was probably like 3 million. And so where I lived would like kind of now be considered sort of the outer suburbs. But back then, I lived down sort of like a dirt road from the main road, and there was just nothing back there at all. It was quite rural, which is a good way to grow up, as far as I can tell. So basically, I grew up into a Baptist kind of, not only a family, but sort of milieu. So like everyone I knew pretty much was also Baptist. Literally both sides of my family. They didn't always like each other, but they went to different Baptist churches. I think in school I knew some Methodists, and then later on I knew a couple of Catholics. I say in the chapter of a book that I recently was recently published that I knew that in 1990 there were exactly 26 Catholics in my county, and I knew because I knew one of them, right? So it was interesting. And now there are thousands. I mean, I think the population of my county was like 40,000 or something when I was a kid, and now it's 250,000. And so just the amount of change, of sheer change, demographic, just like the amount of space that's been taken away from nature and put into buildings and subdivisions of different sorts, it's a completely different place. And so that's kind of the society in some sense that I was born into. A lot of things, were sort of taken for granted. You had a lot of nice cultural stuff. There was a continuity. So the kind of food that we ate, the music that we listened to, the way that we saw life, pretty much everyone had probably 90% of things in common on a Venn diagram. And, it was stifling a bit, perhaps, if you look at it in a negative way, but you didn't necessarily know that was the case. And the cultural continuity felt really nice. Like you kind of had this shared understanding with everyone around you. And so, yeah, that's kind of the culture I grew into. And of course, like I said, I grew up evangelical in the Baptist church. And there were just a lot of things that you take for granted kind of in that church. The idea of personal salvation being the most fundamental, important thing. And the idea that you were a sinner, and that, Jesus gave his life for you, and that allowed you to then have sort of the credentials, so to speak, to enter heaven. And so for us, you had this idea of community, but it wasn't really tied to the church. I mean, like in a normal sense, I don't know how to describe it. So
Well, I like this idea of spiritual credentials. That's quite interesting. So it kind of set you on the path to participate in your community. Is that correct? And this participation is something that you felt a very strong draw towards early on and throughout your childhood and throughout your teens and as you approach university?
That's interesting. Yeah, participation was important. I mean, to be part of your community to some extent, you had to go through these different pathways, church being one of them, and friendships and everything kind of being, revolving around that. But like one thing that kind of changed my journey was when I was in high school, I basically I had a class called, what was it called? Like it was a special like report class. And in the class, you had basically an hour and a half every day that you were trying to set aside to write a kind of larger report on anything that you would like to research. And so for me, I just, my goal in the class was just to get the project done as quickly as possible and then have as much time to sleep, because it was right after lunch. I was 15, right? And so it was like I was staying up too late watching bad TV like Seinfeld or whatever. And so I just wanted, just time to be able to do that. And so I decided to pick a report on something I already knew a lot about, I thought, and that was like world mythology. And so I love like the stories of Norse mythology and Greek mythology growing up. So I wrote like a nice 10, 15 page paper, thought I was good, and then turned that in. And it worked for a couple of weeks. I got some nice sleep in the library when no one was looking. But then eventually my supervisor caught on and said that I had to expand that out. And so he said, you got to find some way. And I said, okay, I will add on world religions. I grew up Christian. I feel like I know a lot about that, although I didn't realize at the time that I didn't know as much as I thought. And so I added on, I decided to start with something a little different. So I was like, I'll start with kind of eeny, meeny, miny, mo, Islam. And so I went to the religion section of the library and picked out a book about Islam and started reading about it. And I started noticing a lot of parallels that I wasn't really aware of earlier. I mean, because you kind of learn about world religions a bit, but you don't understand how their claims or not kind of impact upon you. It's sort of like foreign cultures over there somewhere, if that makes any sense. And so for Islam, I was just really struck by the fact that it talks about itself as being a continuation of Judaism and Christianity. And it's different in some sense, but it makes that claim of continuity. And I'd never really understood that. And so I went to actually pick out the Quran and start reading that. So like for me, when growing up and still, when I read the Bible, I feel something in my heart that lets me know that it's the word of God. First, it's like a personal mystical thing. But I always felt that. And I remember picking out the Quran for the first time and feeling the same way when I started reading it. And I didn't really know what to do about that. And so I was like, okay, if this is true, I'll follow wherever I'm supposed to go. But I'm like 15. And so I just want to be really careful about the choices that I make. So I'm like, I'll do a lot of research on it to make sure that that's the case, that it really would be true. And so I spent like months going to the public library, checking out every book possible in Islam. And one day that I was there, a book kind of fell out in front of me called A Short Introduction to the Bahá'í Faith. And I'd never heard of that before. And so I checked out the book, started reading it a bit, and then I found some things kind of interesting, I suppose. But then at the end of the month, I just turned it back into the library. I guess I didn't feel like I had time to go on a tangent. And I had a dream. And in this dream, I never have dreams like this. I haven't had a dream like this since. I felt like God was telling me to check out the book again and actually pay attention. And so I was like, okay, sure, God, whatever you want. And so went, checked out the book and started reading it more thoroughly and with more care. And I really noticed the themes like progressive revelation, the idea that there's one God, that he creates, humanity, and that he has evolved, like he's created religion to serve us. And it's, kind of relevant to wherever humanity was at that time, whether it was, developmentally, culturally. I mean, the sort of guidance that we might need for a small tribe, in a rural part of the world, thousands of years ago, might be pretty different than the guidance that we might need today and various stages in between. And so I thought that was really interesting and pretty compelling. And eventually I found the writings of Baha'u'llah, the founder of Bahá'í Faith. And so I started.
Hey, Caleb, let me put a pause in there because I'm sure that Wade's going to really jump into this. And as we approach our first commercial break, I'm going to encourage all of the listeners to put their comments into the chat. So your involvement is still very much encouraged, despite this being a pre-recorded show. This will air live and is airing live. So we encourage everybody to put their comments into the chat. I'm curious at that point, what happened to the project of Islam? Were you still were you complete your project? It may have started to dovetail and start to mix together. because at this point you're just discovering the Baha'i faith. So was that where did the Islam piece as a youth? Where were you with the study of Islam at that point?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for me, like, I think part of the conflict that I was trying to understand in my analysis of Islam to try to see if it was true or not was there were things about it that I didn't completely understand. So the way that, like, because Islam claims to be a continuation, but then there are disconnections in between those things. And it's strange in some ways. Like, if you read the Quran, it says that it's a confirmation of the Torah, so like the Old Testament, and the Gospel, which is the New Testament. And it says that many times. And then, but when you go into sort of Islamic theology, like, they pay lip service. They'll say that, yes, we believe in the person of Jesus, that he was a prophet from God. And we believe in, the same way about Moses. But when it actually comes to any specific beliefs about Jesus, for example, that Christians hold, like, there's actually not that much in common, because Muslims, through history, if not through their scriptures, have rejected the Bible as a valid source of inspiration, of revelation. Then they can't actually go back there and find the same things that Christians find. So I found that really interesting. And when I was researching the Baha'i faith, the Baha'i faith claims to be a continuation of not only Judaism, Christianity, but also Islam as well. And so the way that it put Islam into context for me made a lot of sense. Stuff that I couldn't completely understand with probably an Islamic only framework made more sense to me as a Christian at the time from a Baha'i standpoint.
Interesting. Well, the burning question from myself, and I guess I'm somebody that's not a church or spiritual leader. I'm focused more on philosophy. But the burning question that I have, that I'm assuming some of the listeners may also have, is, and when I ask this question, Caleb, I'd like to actually set it up for when we return from the commercial break. So I'm going to ask the question. I'm going to give you some time to think about it. And when we come back into studio, we're going to have Wade I'm going to tee Wade up with this. The question is a burning deep question about how did the conflict start to arise? Where did these two seemingly overlapping, I guess, books and fundamentally religious, like essentially religious books, how did they start to fray, and how is conflict? Is it from the book, and where, like, how does it? Did you notice any of that? So maybe think of the books themselves, or whether it was the people. How did the conflict start to surface between these cultures? That's something that I'm very interested in. Hopefully, you can have a little bit of a thought on that. And when we come back, we're going to bring Wade into the studio, and you guys can continue on. I may come back into the show towards the end of the show. Wade's got full discretion on that. That's usually if there's a value for me to come in. Sometimes he does. Most of the time he does. Sometimes he doesn't. But it's completely up to Wade. So I'll take you to commercial break now. Remember to put your likes, your comments, all of your comments and engagement. Put it into the comments there, into the chat, and we'll see you right back after this commercial break.
Diversity is our strength, is the essence of sitting in the shade of another tree. This book unites various voices from major faiths like Christianity, Islam, Bahá'í, Judaism, Buddhism, and Hinduism. Through personal narratives and deep insights, it explores the transformative power of interfaith dialogue. In a world increasingly defined by rigidity, this book calls readers to embrace empathy and understanding. Contributors engage in candid conversations, revealing commonalities among diverse beliefs and demonstrating that our shared humanity transcends religious affiliations. Sitting in the shade of another tree is a window into meaningful interfaith encounters, celebrating dialogue, shared values, and unity. Whether deeply faithful or simply curious, readers are invited to explore the richness of diverse spiritual perspectives, fostering a more compassionate world where differences are appreciated and understanding thrives. Join the contributors beneath the shade of diverse beliefs, where lessons emerge, highlighting the beauty of respectful dialogue and the enrichment that comes from learning from others' faiths. This book is an inspiring call to sit, listen, and discover the profound beauty of unity in diversity. You can purchase Sitting in the Shade of Another Tree on Amazon now, from Choir Publishing and Patheos.
And for those who want to purchase it, there is that QR code. And yes, this is Wade Franson live with Dan Sanderson live in the studio. We are also watching this pre-recorded episode of Created in the Image of God featuring Caleb Gilleland from Scotland. And it's quite an interesting experience, actually, to be able to do that versus being live online. Go ahead and scan that QR code, or if you don't want to, post your chats in the comment, because we will be giving away a copy of this book, which features a chapter by Caleb Gilleland, PhD candidate at the University of Edinborough, Scotland. And we're very grateful to have had him as a pre-recorded guest, and very grateful to have you as the audience here with us, hopefully commenting now in the chat. So Dan, wanted to take a couple of minutes to comment on that first segment. And I thought it was interesting that Caleb was describing his upbringing in a Baptist situation and talking about the way we saw life was 90% aligned if you mapped it out on a Venn diagram. Mm-hmm. And I also liked his expression of his faith by having that dream and saying, "Sure, God, whatever you want." Mm. Thought that was quite an entertaining moment. And then he talked about Islam, and this is something I'd like to get your take on, because I think this plays into the unfolding of this whole dialogue around religion. Mm-hmm. And why the conflicts arise between religions, which we'll let Caleb comment on in the next segment. But to just sort of flesh out that first segment, he said what he found was that Muhammad, the prophet, and the Quran claimed to be a continuation of the Torah and the gospel of Moses and Jesus. But then he found that subsequent theology and commentary from Islam, and perhaps the people themselves, only paid lip service to that and found ways to discount what the word actually said. Now I'm expanding on the thought, but what I know happens is to allow arguments to arise between our text and theirs. Mm. And of course, our text is right and theirs is wrong. Right? Rather than seeking to find where the rub is really, as you might say, where the wisdom is between these two texts, rubbing against each other, it's just so much easier to say, well, theirs was wrong and ours is right. Theirs was old and ours is new. There's this whole thing we had in last week's show about the old covenant and the new covenant. And I think it was last week's show, and I tried to bring up, well, wait a minute, there are many covenants in the Bible, right? There are many covenants. There's not just an old one and a new one.
Well, wait a minute, you're going to lose me, Wade, because I have to comment about Caleb here, and I think where he's going with his research, and I'm watching this. This is a very unique experience, as you mentioned. So watching it, number one, I feel like a hockey coach watching. Or bringing the kids up to watch the game or the football game and seeing, and that's how I look as like omniscient sort of like third party viewer, right? And it's really fascinating to do that. I think where Caleb's going actually with
Monday
his
morning
research.
quarterback, Dan, is that what you're saying?
Well, yeah, I mean, we have this superpower to be able to do this,
Yes,
right?
of course.
We have this ability to do it. And I'm hoping where Caleb's research is actually going is to that pivot from where there's overlap to where all of a sudden there's problematic. And he kind of, by the tone of the way he was explaining himself and just me like listening to it again, it's almost like the church fathers or the intellectual leaders of the time, like way back, would like almost have somewhat of an open mind, like they're like, okay, well, let's have a look at this. And if there's intractables in terms of logic or things that just completely make it incompatible, you understand how the roadblocks would go up, right? And so I'm assuming that that's where the division starts to happen, right?
Maybe at a scholarly level, but I think there are multiple competing interests here. So let's say the scholars might be more detached. They might be actually looking at an intractable roadblock, or they could be like Gary Larson Far Side scholars, right? For those who know Gary Larson, he's the guy that did these little cartoons. Often there were scientists in lab coats, and you think scientists in lab coats, they're operating at such a high level, but in his cartoons, they were often very, very petty, and they were fighting over who had eaten more M&Ms, right? Or something in the laboratory versus the science that they were supposed to be working on. So even the scholars might have an ego component, and what is intractable has to do with their ego attachment to their idea. Then you have the priesthood, who they have power at stake, right? They have to maintain and establish their power by never being wrong, right? And again, so there's that attachment. Or you have the common man and the common beliefs that might be current among men in that day, or their own appetites or weaknesses or lack of intellectual ability or whatever it is that causes them to not do the hard work, to not tackle the math equation, to not figure out the solution that might bridge and harmonize the issues, versus claiming that it's intractable so that you can start throwing babies out with bathwater.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that would be my hope, is they look at the philosophy of it rather than try and stay, so detached and so personal about it, right? It's
well, we've got a good comment here from Jet, so let's throw that in. I think Jet highlights a really interesting point. Suggestion on the source of content: the difference between revelation and religion. Revelation is the teachings that are from God. Religion is what man has done with the revelations, and I think this is absolutely true. And he then continues that thought by saying, often what we've done with the revelations was good, but sometimes it has been negative, growing out of misunderstandings of the revelation. And again, it's quite an easy thing then to just discount the contradictory evidence and throw it out because my understanding of the Quran is correct. Therefore, what the Bible taught must be wrong, right? Because the Quran came after the Bible. And the inverse is also true, right? The Christians don't accept the Quran as having any validity in the first place, so they don't even investigate it. Or if they do, it's with a negative effort in an attempt to disprove it. Anyway, those are some initial thoughts. I found it interesting when Caleb then said that for him, the Baha'i faith helped him put Islam into context. I can share from my own experience that many Christians, frankly, show a lot of disrespect to the Old Testament. But we brought, and I use that term Old Testament, but in terms of the Bible, there are two testaments. I don't like to call them covenants. they're two witnesses, they're not necessarily two covenants. But anyway, my point is that we had a ton of respect for the Old Testament, and it helped us see bridges and enlightenment where others saw conflict and error. So those are just my thoughts initially on this, and then we'll welcome.
That's fascinating. I was listening to you, and then as you were moving past witness and covenant and the distinction, I had to sort that out. I was a good 10-second lag behind you, but that's really interesting. I mean, that's the thing. People, if you pay attention and you think about what people are saying, Wade drew a very interesting distinction. Can the audience put it in the chat? We'd love to hear what you have to say. Good job.
Thank
Wade.
you. And now I'd like to hear what I have to say when I get to talk to Caleb in the next pre-recorded segment.
Yep,
we'll be back with you live probably shortly. I might even interrupt myself at some point. All right, here we go. Thank you, Dan, for having teed this up so beautifully. False prophets abound, and I am not going to proclaim myself to be a prophet. But given that I'm pre-recording this, I'm going to predict that we will bring Dan back in probably live at the end of this, given the time constraints that we have. Because we'll have the opportunity when we're live, which we are now, but I'm living in the past, living in the future as we pre-record. We'll probably run into a time constraint with our current recording time and have Dan come back in live on the show when it airs. So thank you, Dan. That is a great question that Dan just teed up. From your perspective, where do these conflicts arise? And I think this is a fascinating topic, and I want to thank Dan for honing in on this issue. Where do these conflicts arise if Christianity is a continuation of Judaism, which the Bible really shows that it is? Though probably as a Baptist, you might have grown up thinking that it was a discontinuation of Judaism, right? Does that play into this, and has that perspective changed in terms of understanding the similarities and differences and why these conflicts arise?
Yeah, that's a great question. In some ways, that's at the heart of my research. And I guess you have sort of like these two different areas of disconnect. You have the disconnect between Judaism and Christianity, like historically when that happened. And then you have the disconnect later on between Christianity and Islam. So I kind of approach them a little bit differently. So when it comes to the continuation between the continuity errors, so to speak, between Judaism and Christianity, it has a lot to do with the expectations at the time. So you have to put yourself back in the sort of a first century time frame. Like, what is the world like? What is the story that's going on? What are Jews in the Holy Land? Like, what are the conflicts that they see? And it turns out, so basically, I'll kind of juxtapose a couple of things. So growing up as a Baptist, you have this idea that there is a discontinuity because Paul and to some extent Jesus as well, but not in the same way. Like, they talk about the fact that faith is superior over works. And, you get Luther in the Middle Ages with the Protestant Reformation really hitting that home, so that it becomes the most Protestant Christian sort of thing that you can say about faith is that, like, faith is, there's nothing that you can do to merit salvation, only what Jesus has done on your behalf. And so when they take that and you read Paul, then it sounds like Paul is throwing sort of his heritage, the Jewish heritage that he came up with, the idea of living under the Torah and living under the law, like kind of just under the bus. And that, instead it's all this sort of like emotional belief in Jesus. I don't know how to describe it exactly. The word in Greek is pistis, and it means a lot of stuff. Some of which are problematic.
Did Paul suffer a little bit from self-loathing? I mean, after all, he persecuted the Christians. He occasioned the death of them. He stood by their clothes as they were being stoned to death, or I forget what it is, threw his coat down to give his assent to the death of Christians. Did he possibly suffer under a little bit of self-loathing as a result of the revulsion of realizing what he had done against the people of God, who had exceeded his own capabilities in recognizing Jesus, whereas his whole life was designed to reach that point of recognizing the Messiah when he came, and then he missed it and even killed the ones who did?
I mean, emotionally, like as a human, when you're looking at the anthropology of something, you have to imagine that like they do have regrets about things like that. And maybe in some ways they have some trauma that they're dealing from. I mean, even though trauma is a pretty modern concept. But like, as far as you can tell in the writings of Paul, he never seems to be like that messed up about it, to be honest. Like when he looks back at his life as, a Pharisee before he became a Christian, so to speak, he's basically, I was blameless in all my doings, like as a Jew. And so I think for him, I don't think he looks back on it in that way. I don't think he spends a lot of time. I think he's a very forward-thinking person. He's not trying to really hash out past details that didn't work out. I mean, like there's a chapter in the book of Romans called Romans 7, and there's a lot of ways you can read that. It sounds, from a certain sort of Lutheran bent, it sounds like Paul is he's agonizing over his personal sins, and he understands that he's helpless before God's judgment. But like the way that a lot of modern scholarship has looked at that is that it's actually his idea of what it was like to be the Jewish nation under the law. So without going into too much detail, because obviously there are time constraints and this sort of thing, there's been a lot of sort of scholarship that's come out since the 1970s called The New Perspective on Paul. And it's really challenged a lot of these like Lutheran ideas, this idea that everything, like history doesn't matter that much, like that you have this sort of this individual relationship with God, like you as a person were born with original sin. Jesus is the way to get out of that original sin, and then you can go to heaven when you die. Like the Bible doesn't actually talk a lot about any of those things in that
exactly.
way. Yeah, and the other thing, a criticism.
Well, let me press the pause button right there, and let me also say that I can already see we're going to have you back with your permission. So we're going to go a little bit slower. We may not get through the entire story here because I want to unpack. I want to do justice to this question that Dan raised, and I want to focus on this moment in time to lay the groundwork later to talk about Islam and then the Baha'i faith, because I think it's really important not to reach hasty conclusions. And I actually want to go back even further. But let's just say I 100% agree with you about what you're saying about Paul being forward-looking. He recognized Jesus, right? He became an apostle. He, in all this talk about having a personal relationship with Jesus, he was struck blind on the road to Damascus, and Jesus appeared to him personally, right? I believe that's true. And so, yes, he was full of faith in the sacrifice of Jesus as complete and total forgiveness of his sins. So the self-loathing that I referred to was probably actually not of a personal nature. He was filled with faith and joy and love from that relationship that he had. But there may have been some theological self-loathing in the sense that he was trying to unpack and illustrate for the Jews of his time where their theology had gone wrong. Is that a statement you might agree? Because obviously most of his work is doing exactly that, explaining how they missed it, what it was about the change and the shift, what it was, what it wasn't, carefully. And Peter says, Paul has much in his writings that is confusing, and the unlearned wrest it to their own destruction, as he was carefully walking the razor's edge, as I call it, to parse this out.
Yeah, I think there's something to that. I guess like when I look at especially like Romans and Galatians, like those are the ones that most people kind of go to talk about these sorts of questions. Like I think as part of the new perspective, and I kind of buy into this, I think that one of the main theme of those two letters isn't sort of like how do individuals come to salvation exactly, and it's not even trying to figure out like where did Jews go wrong, because like one of the things that the first New Perspective guy was called E.P. Sanders, and his idea was that it wasn't when Paul was looking at these things, he didn't have a list of problems that he was coming to, to try to solve through Jesus. Jesus happened to him, and then he understood intuitively that was a solution, and then he had to go looking for the problems that were solved by it. And then you have sort of the other way of looking at it, which is sort of the N.T. Wright, like the Tom Wright kind of way, which I'm probably even more dialed into as a scholar, is this idea that like there's a big story, like a meta narrative in some sense. So if you're Jewish, like you're part of something called the covenant. And so in the end of Deuteronomy, way back in the Old Testament, God makes a contract, so to speak, with the Jewish people. And it's basically saying, if you do what I ask you to do, really good things are going to happen to you. Things are going to be really great. And if you don't, oh boy, things are going to get really rough. And when he's doing that, he's not talking to individual Jews. He's talking to the Jewish people as like a nation, as a whole. And so, things kind of go up and down for a long ways during the rest of the Old Testament, so like Jewish history. But then at some point, they start going kind of down, down, down. And then, they're thrown into exile in Babylon. And even though they eventually come back, there's this sense that not all has ever been restored. That like you're kind of waiting one day when it will be restored by what we now think of as a Messiah. So the return to king of Judaism, of the Jewish people. And so for Paul, for Tom Ride, right, and he's kind of putting this on Paul, and I think it's probably true, there's this sense in the air in the first century that something has to change, that somebody needs to, they're under occupation, and this, they're occupied by the Romans. Before that, they're occupied by the Greeks, right? So it's like they're like, it shouldn't be like this. We're the people of God. Like, God needs to come set things right. How does this need to happen? And then for Paul, he sees the death of Jesus and the resurrection of Jesus as being a way for the Jewish people to be consolidated in the person of Jesus in a mystical sense. Die outside, to get out of the law, you have to die. And then when you're through the resurrection, the people that are kind of mystically identified with Jesus are no longer bound by that. So they can chart their own destiny.
So there are so many interweaving threads here. The tapestry of God's master plan is unbelievably vast. And there are so many places we could go right now with merit and fruit. I want to add, though, the element of time. And Dr. John's famous song comes to mind, which now I'm really dating myself. Probably neither of you have heard this. I was in the right place, but it must have been the wrong time, right? And so there's the sense of right understanding, wrong time for that understanding. What I mean by that is Millerism, right? And the great expectation and then the great disappointment of 1844. There's a component of prophecy related to that covenant. You go back to Leviticus and you have the 7 times prophecy. I will punish you 7 times 7. That was part of the covenant, right? That was part of the contract. Well, that equates to 2,520 years. And then you have the 1,260 years in Daniel. And then you have different prophetic timelines. And when we come back from the next commercial break, we're going to dive into this a little bit. And we're going to go way back in history and talk about what came before Judaism and how this is an ongoing process that started in the Garden of Eden. And that there's a way of looking at it. And this is kind of my own idea, which I'll introduce and I'd like to get you to talk about. But the way in which I understand that vast span of time and what each of these phases, dispensations is one term, and the various covenants, right? Because the covenant that you mentioned, it's a contract, but would you agree that it goes beyond a transactional thing, right? A quid pro quo, in exchange for due consideration. I work with legal contracts all the time, And you've got this phraseology at the top, which essentially, describes this is a contract this contract is made valid by the exchange of goods, or to use Netflix and, Go Call Saul and, Breaking Bad. Hey, he's standing there with a bag over his head. He's about to be murdered. He's like, put $1 in my pocket, put $1 in my pocket. And once the dollar is put in the pocket of this lawyer, now he has, lawyer, client, attorney privilege, and whatever happens next can be sealed from the eyes of the law because a binding contract has been made with the exchange of money, right? So this covenant, this contract has that element, right? In exchange for this, I promise and covenant to do that. But would you agree it goes beyond a transactional covenant?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that when you're looking at this idea of covenant and these transactions, for me, it's telling a big story about Israel. It's telling a big story about the Jewish people. And it's not primarily about an individual relationship before God. And that exists, and that's important. But I don't think that's what Paul is talking about. I think when you look at like Romans and Galatians, what he's talking about isn't like the Romans road. Like, how do I accept that I'm a sinful person, get past that, accept that Jesus died on my behalf and go to heaven. Like, that's not what's going on. What's going on?
Isn't he essentially summarizing it, saying, look, it's not about that that transactional effort. I was a perfect Jew before the law, and it means nothing.
Yeah.
The covenant transcends that transactional relationship.
Exactly. But I think that even more than that, I think that what the big theme of these books is not like how to sort out all this stuff. It kind of takes that for granted in the background, the story that's going on. What it's trying to say is like how, yes, Jesus is the Messiah of the Jews, right? So he's sent by God to save Israel. But what happens when people who aren't part of Israel believe that Jesus is king, is Messiah? Which started happening, you know what I mean? Like Paul was going out and teaching people and they believed. Like, I mean, why, like, if I'm an American, right? I live in the UK, right? So I respect the monarchy. In some ways, I didn't quite like it. I think they have something, in America that in some ways we wish that we had, separating out the functions of president and head of the state. But at the same time, it's like, it's not my king, right? So what could happen to, emotionally for me to make me understand that, like, King Charles is my king? Like, those things don't seem like they could work. But people spontaneously started understanding that Jesus was their king, Jesus was their Lord, that weren't Jewish. And so what Paul is trying to do is find a way for the people of God that's being constituted around Jesus to include people that aren't Jewish. And then, of course, with history, that becomes the majority of the people that would call themselves Christian, not very long after that. So it's about the unity of humanity to some extent, is what I would say.
Right. So I'm just so thoroughly enjoying this. I hope the audience is too. I hope you'll put your comments in the chat as we go through this. When we come back from the next commercial break, which, by the way, let me remind the audience, we will be giving away a book. Since this is in the future, we haven't decided which book yet, but we will be giving away a book, which we'll announce on the live show, to whomever has the comment that Caleb likes the best at the end of the show. So that part of the show is real and live. When we come back from this commercial break, we're going to go way back in history, unpack this idea, and discuss also how Jesus was the king and also how he was not the king. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
In a world where beliefs are tested and mysteries unfold.
Welcome to the Royal Falcon.
In a world where beliefs are tested and mysteries unfold, one boot takes you on a journey of prophecy, faith, and the unexpected. Followers of William Miller held their breath as they awaited the prophesied second coming of Jesus in 1844. But when the advent didn't unfold as expected, the great disappointment swept across the land. However, what if the story didn't end there? What if the Spirit of Christ did return in 1844 in the Middle East? Dive into the prophecies of Daniel, where the past and present converge to reveal a hidden truth. Embark on a captivating journey, where the threads of history and belief intertwine in ways you could never imagine. 1844, Convergence in Prophecy, a meticulously researched and documented exploration, unfolds like a mystery, captivating and engaging. A must-read for those who seek to understand our world's intricate tapestry of religions and their surprising unity. Are you ready to challenge your perceptions and uncover the hidden truths of our times? Embark on a journey that speaks to the heart of today's challenges and offers hope from the most unexpected source. 1844, Convergence in Prophecy. Dare to explore. Dare to believe.
This is Wade Franson. I'm back with Caleb Gilleland over in Scotland, Edinborough. And we are talking about, what are we talking about? We are talking about Paul within Islam, roadblocks and possibilities in Bahá'í and Muslim dialogue with Christianity. And we're stuck in the New Testament era. We're stuck in the time of Jesus. But we're going to go way back even further. But before we do, Caleb, we didn't unpack in the first opening segment, the cultural transition that you experienced when you went to Scotland, what you went there for, what you're doing, and how you're adjusting to that.
Yeah, so we've lived in the UK about 4 years now. I had a life before this. I did marketing for a long time, and I got kind of tired of it. I was kind of doing the same websites and the same ad campaigns all the time. And so my wife is a corporate attorney. She's doing really well. And so it made it seem like if I ever wanted to do what I really love, now was the time to do that. So we moved to the UK because they have master's programs that are shorter, honestly, than America's, and universities that are basically as good, if not better, depending on the subject matter. And in theology and religion, they're probably better. And so did a one-year master's at King's College London in religion and theology. And then we moved up here at the University of Edinburgh because they have the best Christian Muslim program around. And so as far as getting used to it, it's relatively easy. We've lived in some places before that are quite different, such as Central Asia. We lived in Kazakhstan for a year, which is actually where we originally met each other. And we've traveled around quite a lot. I mean, the UK, in some ways, it's like, is it Europe? Is it America? It's like kind of in between.
So they say travel is an education, right? Have these travels also enabled you to sort of broaden your perspective and open you up to seeing things from multiple perspectives?
It's impossible to travel and not have that happen to you. Was it Mark Twain that said travel is fatal to all forms of prejudice?
I love it.
It's true. I mean, like in some ways, like there are things that you grow up with that are solidified by traveling, but then there are things that, your mind has to open because your brain has to account for the different experiences that you haven't experienced before. And how do you kind of catalog those into yourself?
Well, I remember as a young freshman in college, I went to a program in Scotland on the bonny banks of Loch Lomond. And it was a summer camp program. And I was there an assistant counselor and helping with the campus improvement function. And it was basically 300 teenagers in a sheep field in a tent city that emerged in the summer. And I was just floored and inspired by this mix of cultures, the Irish, the Scottish, the British, the Germans, the French. From all over Europe, there were these teenagers there. And it was just so vibrant and so exciting with all these different accents and languages and perspectives. So I have incredibly fond memories. I went back 5 more times after that for a total of 6 to that program and visited your neck of the woods. So I think you and I just have so much in common, which is why I'm so thoroughly enjoying this. So now for you and for our audience, I'm going to take back and show my kind of pet theory around the greater plan of God. And if we have time tonight or in a future episode, we'll dig into a little bit more specifically Islam and where I believe it's featured in the Bible and get your take on that, because I believe that Islam and Muhammad are prominently featured in the Bible. And once one sees it, it unlocks a new perspective on the book of Revelation, which describes events from the time of Jesus to our day. So why would it not say something about Islam, right? And if it does, where does it say something about it, and what does it say about it? So, and it's integral to the whole story of the book of Revelation. But we'll unpack that in the hopefully near future. Right now, I want to go back to Adam in the Garden of Eden. And the first 2 commandments were this yin-yang of be fruitful and multiply and dress and keep the garden. Those were the commandments given to Adam and Eve and thus us as human beings. Be fruitful and multiply and dress and keep the garden. It doesn't get any simpler than that. We have done the 1 commandment perfectly, right? We have been very fruitful and multiplied enormously. I should caveat that. So we haven't always perfectly obeyed that commandment because half the time we spend killing each other, which is the opposite of multiplying, right? But nonetheless, we became the most invasive species the world has ever known. We have overtaken the planet. We are, going on 8 billion strong or whatever the number is now, 9 billion. And despite the fact that we spend too much time killing each other, we're doing that, but we're not always dressing and keeping the garden either. We do that intermittently and in spurts, and sometimes we are the destroyers of the planet. But my point is that is an expansion dispensation, a go forth and conquer dispensation, with the caveat of dress and keep the garden. But the primary force is expand. If we think of the solar system, expanding, the sun is expanding. It's not shrinking into a black hole, it's expanding. And this is a theme, a pattern throughout the entire universe. Then we come to Noah, the preacher of righteousness, who is in Bahá'í theology, you might say, I believe, the next manifestation, right? The next instance of a messenger sent to correct the course of humanity. And what is the correction? It is an extreme consolidation. It repented God that he had created man, because every thought of his mind was only evil continually. And so he, according to the story of the flood, destroyed almost all of humanity in the flood and pared it down to four families: Noah and his wife and his three sons and their wives. An extreme consolidation, and unexpected surely to the people of that day, who thought they were gloriously fulfilling God's intent for them as they were being fruitful and multiplying. You follow me? But they weren't dressing and keeping the garden physically or spiritually. So God took corrective action. Then the next one you get is Abraham, whom God says, you will be the father of many nations. Leave your father and mother, go to a land that I will show you, expand outward, and I will make you the father of many nations. And indeed, not just nations, but religions. Many religions came from Abraham: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, for example, right? And many variations thereof. You know, how many Islamic states are there today, literally by the definition of practicing Sharia law? There are 6 or 8 or more, 25 Muslim majority nations. I may have my numbers wrong, and how many Christian nations have there been? And there's only one Jewish state today. That's a whole nother Oprah, which we may get to in this lengthy discourse we're having. My point is this: then you have Moses, again, taking a few of those tribes and consolidating them in a city on a hill and focusing on the laws, not focusing on just expansion of many nations, diverse cultures, diverse thoughts, diverse religions throughout time and space. Now we're taking and consolidating a unique, chosen, special people with an extreme focus on laws. And then you come to Jesus, which is, I'll let you speak here again in a minute and respond to all this madness that I'm spouting. Then you get to Jesus, who again is telling his disciples, go forth, preach the gospel to the entire world, the good news. And also, forget about all these 613 laws. There are 2 laws: love God and love your fellow man. Love, love, love. And the sign of the Christian covenant, in my opinion, just like the sign of the covenant with Moses, the sign of the covenant with Abraham. Well, let's go back. I don't know what the sign of the covenant with Adam is. There's a mark on Cain. Maybe that's it. You're not allowed to kill other people. You're supposed to be fruitful and multiply. You're not supposed to kill. Maybe that's the sign of the Adamic covenant, right? The Noachian covenant is the rainbow. The sign is the rainbow. I will no longer do this. I will no longer wipe out the whole earth with a flood. Then Abraham, the sign of the covenant is the circumcision. The sign of the covenant with Moses is the seventh-day Sabbath. And I struggled with this because I kept the Sabbath for decades and the Jewish holy days until I realized, no, the sign of the Christian covenant is John 13:35. By this shall all men know you, that you have love one for another. The visible outward sign is simply love. So you have this massive expansion, go forth. The Jews were not expecting that at all. They were expecting a king to come and establish the Jewish nation as the light to the world. Not that Jesus would be the light to the world and allow the Gentiles to come in wholesale and even reject their law, right? And be still counted as his disciples as the religion unfolded. But rather, they thought they would have to, become circumcised and become Jews, and the Jewish nation would be the guiding light for the whole world. But that's not what happened. And I'm going to say one more thing and then pause and let you respond. This is part of the answer to what Dan was asking earlier, in my opinion, of where do these tensions come from? Where do these conflicts come from? Each religion believes they have understood what their religious leader brought, right? The children of Adam thought they understood. Noah said otherwise. The children of Noah thought they understood. Abraham said otherwise. The children of Abraham thought they understood. Moses said otherwise. And you have this yin-yang of expansion and consolidation. And so it's like at a micro level in the family, it's said that grandparents and grandparents and their grandchildren get along so well because they have a common enemy. Right? The common enemy is the parents. The grandparents remember what a horrible teenager you were and how much grief you gave to your parents. and they almost smile and laugh when now your kids are giving you the same grief. So grandparents and grandchildren have a common enemy, and there's this yin yang, right? And that's one way of looking at what happened when Jesus came, and the parents of the Christian religion, the Jews, missed it, but the children understood, right? So grossly oversimplifying, but maybe there's some truth to this. What's your reaction to all this?
Yeah, I think that there could be some truth to that. I mean, I guess the way that I look at it, my personally, anyway, is that like when you have these different sort of, what we as Baha'is would say are manifestations of God, but these sort of seminal people, Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and so on. Like in some ways, they all are kind of like changing of the guard. They're kind of like moments in time when they're epic shifts in some way. But I think the overarching story for me that I kind of buy into is the idea that they're all kind of like, with Adam, you have creation, you have God, whatever it means that Adam was the first person. From a literal perspective, like the one I grew up in, I would say, literally Adam and Eve were the first two people in the world. I think the way that I would think about that now, perhaps, is that it's, they were the first two conscious humans or something in a world that already existed. In fact, like you look at the accounts in Genesis, Cain needed to go marry somebody, and who did Cain marry? Like, there were Cain built cities of who, right? And so to me, it always seems like it's a new creation in the midst of something that already existed. But God created that too. I mean, it's relative to whenever you think God did it. It's all God's responsible for everything in any case.
Yeah, you might say it's just the way that God packaged up the story for our consumption based on the situations at the time, the comprehension at the time.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, for me, it's more like this overarching idea of creation, and then God kind of recreating, like there was sin, there was a fall, whatever that means. And then God used Abraham specifically through his family to be kind of like a force of recreation in the world gone wrong, so to speak. And so Moses and then Jesus were. Well,
and this is directly from the Bible. The Bible speaks of he recreation. He makes all things new again.
Exactly. So like to me, it's not about like the nitty gritty. It's not trying to like make things into an algorithm. So like with the way I grew up is like there was an algorithm. It's like, you could go to a restaurant and people could, draw it on a piece of paper, a napkin. It's sort of like, here's you on like this cliff, right? And then here's God on the other side of the cliff. And then there's a chasm in between, and there's no way for you to get to him through your own efforts. And so you have to accept Jesus as sort of like a plank or a bridge that kind of, gets you across one way to the other. And so there's an algorithm. If yes, then salvation. If no, then not. But that doesn't seem like that's what the Bible's about. Like you can, if that's the theology that matters, if that's the only thing that matters, then why is there anything after Genesis 3 all the way up to Jesus dying, on the cross and resurrected? You could skip the entire rest of the Old Testament. You get just a tiny piece out of the New Testament, and you're done. You don't even need a book of Revelation. You don't need anything else. It's just, that's sort of a transaction outside of time, if that makes sense. And when you look at the Bible as a whole, it doesn't make any sense. So for me, all this, what's more important than an algorithm or a transaction is the idea of narrative. This is God's story that he's writing, and, his creation and then recreation through this way that he's trying, like, this path of prophets, this people of God, and, sometimes whenever you have a new prophet or manifestation, like such Jesus, for example, the way that the people is constituted changes. A lot of things change, but it's always in service of kind of widening out and expanding. And so, like you say, the Jewish people thought that they should be the city on the hill. And in some ways that was what they were designed to do. They were designed to be an example to all the nations around. And, maybe to some extent they succeeded, but in the end, they kind of failed in that vocation, according to what the Old Testament seems like it says. And so basically God uses the idea of Messiah to reconstitute the people around him. And then the way that I look at it is when you see like the Roman Empire, like Moses created a civilization out of nothing. They went into a country and like a piece of land and became a nation, a people, but Christianity wasn't like that. Christianity was, this poor carpenter and the people that followed him, and he died. He was not even a great king like the Jews expected. He wound up dying. Like that's a complete loser, not a king. But so from the very bottom up, like it was almost like Christianity was a virus that infected an already existing host, which is the Roman Empire. And then it took the Roman Empire was kind of the opposite. It had the top, and the top was Caesar, who was king, who often said that, he was the son of God, right?
Right.
And so, but it was ruling on on an empire of power, of coercion, of frankly slavery. I mean, the Roman Empire, like many empires, the Soviet Union, being the most recent example of something like this, it only can economically exist because of slavery. You had to go out and conquer to get slaves in order to make the machinery work. And the Roman Empire was built on that. And so Christianity, sort of like its viral nature from the very bottom, kind of went up and infected an already existing organism and took it over to where in 300 years, like you went from going Caesar is Lord to everyone having to say, well, God is Lord or Jesus is
right.
Lord.
And those same Caesars and kings and all being coronated in his name, right?
Yeah,
Every
exactly.
knee bowed to Jesus because literally you bowed your knee to accept the authority that came from God.
Yeah, I mean, it's
in the name of Jesus.
It's the ultimate underdog story. And
Right.
so in some ways, like it's almost an exception that proves the rule in religious history. Normally it's, God does something, it catches on fire. There's a nation, a people, sort of like, like Judaism was, and even like Islam was. Something comes out of nowhere, it becomes a huge empire, and then they build a civilization. But in the case of Jesus, it was taking an already existing great civilization, like great, not necessarily good, and then basically changing it from the inside out. And I mean, as a narrative, I think that's just really cool. That's how God got from a particular people that were trying to be an example, but it wasn't working, to just infecting the entire thing and making the whole system actually reflect God to some extent.
Wonderful. Well, I'm gonna conclude this segment with one more comment. Then we're going to go to a commercial break, and when we come back, we'll actually be live in the studio with Dan and myself, because we'll have to bid adieu to Caleb as we bring this pre-recorded session to a close due to time constraints and time differences between Scotland and here. But where I want to leave this before we go into the commercial break, and Caleb will be looking for a time to get you back on as soon as possible to continue this, because all of today's show or tonight's show has really only been about getting us to the point to where we can begin to talk about Paul within Islam, roadblocks and possibilities in Baha'i and Muslim dialogue with Christianity. But look at the amazing groundwork we've laid. We've talked about the Jewish people as a people with a covenant that establishes them as a city on a hill and a nation that is an example to the nations around them. And lo and behold, what do we see around us today? What is going on right now? We are still fighting over that same issue. The entire planet right now, as I speak, is watching that exact same issue unfold. The self-determination of the Jewish people, their right or lack thereof to establish themselves as a distinct people, as a Jewish state in the midst of different peoples, different cultures who are not only at odds with each other, but now literally at war with each other. So we still have not resolved this, and I believe there are very important messages in the Bible prophetically. We're not going to dive deep into this, but we're going to at least point out some things for people to ponder and look at. One of the things I want to share as we conclude this is where and how Islam is mentioned in the Bible. And Caleb, you and I can pick this up directly when you return to the show. So I'm kind of baiting you and making sure that you'll have to come back to have opportunity to fully address this. I'll get an initial short comment from you now. But the main place where I see Islam being mentioned, or certainly where it's introduced, I believe it is mentioned elsewhere as well. But it is introduced in Revelation chapter 12, where a woman comes down from heaven. And in her right hand, she has this, and in her left hand, she has this. And as you read the story of this woman and her offspring that is killed by the dragon, and later you have the earth opening up and swallowing the flood that is sent out by the dragon to devour the woman and her child. She's given a place in the wilderness where she is preserved for 1,260 years. All of this is in the book of Revelation. And at the end of chapter 12, and I didn't totally prep for this, so when we revisit this in a future episode, we'll cite exact chapter and verse of some of these things. But the dragon leaves the woman to make war with the remnant of her seed. And the remnant of her seed, it says, have the law and the testimony of Jesus Christ. Now, in Lutheran theology, the law was nailed to the cross. And I don't know if Luther himself says that or just his followers and descendants. The law is done away. You don't have the law anymore. You only have the testimony of Jesus Christ. So what is this chapter 12 of Revelation talking about, where you have the law, the remnant of her seed that the dragon is making war with, have the law and the testimony of Jesus? They have an integrated view of law and grace, of law and faith. James said, prove to me your faith without the law, and I will prove to you my faith by my works, right? Mm-hmm. Prove to me your faith without works, and I will prove to you my faith by my works. Paul integrates these two things, or James calls out the integration of these two things to balance out and contrast what some people took away from Paul, right? So do you agree with the idea that Revelation chapter 12 is indeed talking about Muhammad and Islam?
I'll be honest with you, like, when kind of diving into scholarship, like, I kind of had to pick an area to focus on, and it wasn't Revelation. I grew up with Revelation, not surprisingly, especially, pre the year 2000 with like Y2K and stuff, which I was.
Well, before you put your foot in it, you might want to look up some answered questions by Abdul Baha, because he talks about Revelation 12 in this context.
That's right. So I am aware that there's some really interesting Baha'i stuff in there. But it's just never been my area of expertise before. So it'd be interesting to learn more about that.
Well, we will dig into that as we come back. And again, it's one view, and it's certainly going to be a controversial view for many, especially when we then later start talking about, well, who is the beast and who is the dragon, right? And who is the child and all of those kinds of things. But again, quoting Dr. John, I was in the right place but the wrong time. The book of Revelation as a whole is like a movie trailer, right? And have you ever had the experience of watching a movie trailer and then when it gives you a completely wrong or different impression, and then when you go watch the movie, it's like nothing what you thought about the movie trailer, the movie actually being about based on the trailer. And it doesn't mean that the trailer wasn't accurately showing you scenes from the movie, but they were out of context. They might have even been out of order. There might have been flashbacks, whatever. You get my point?
Oh, sure.
The book of Revelation is a lot like that, because it not only discusses the time between Jesus and now, which is 2,000 plus years, it discusses hundreds of thousands, you might say even billions of years into the future, because it talks about a time when the elements will melt with fervent heat. So all of this is condensed into one book, and we're looking at it from one point in time, and we really have no clue unless we're incredibly diligent with where, what, when happens and why.
Yeah,
and the role of Islam and the role of the Baha'i faith and the precursor of what happened between Islam and the Baha'i faith, all of this is actually, in the opinion of myself and many Baha'is who study into this, mapped out in the pages of the Bible, and completely and totally consistent with what's in the Bible. So hopefully this is whetting everybody's appetite for when we come back with Caleb again. Any last comments, Caleb? And when we come back from this commercial break, we'll be live with Dan in the studio to talk more about this.
I just want to say thank you to you guys for bringing me on to talk about my research. It's as a PhD student, it's always actually nice to have people that are interested in what you're studying. Which God bless a lot of people that are studying like a sentence from like the Psalms or something. But this is fun to talk about. So I just appreciate being on with y'all.
Wonderful. Thank you, Caleb. So we'll look forward to having you back real soon. Perhaps by the time this show airs, we'll even be able to announce when that might be. So stay tuned. When we come back, we'll wrap up this show with discussions between philosopher Dan Sanders and myself. And remember to put those comments in. We'll have to circle back later with Caleb and suggest some of your comments to him, because he gets to pick who's going to get that free book. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Welcome to the Royal Falcon Foundation. Our curriculum and activities inspire and train adolescents through hands-on experiences, fostering growth and empowerment. Through immersive and challenging experiences, we shape young minds to think independently and develop their leadership skills. Our programs foster new friendships and unity, shaping young leaders to tackle real-world challenges with confidence. We believe in equipping the next generation with the skills to become leaders of tomorrow. Join us at the Royal Falcon Foundation and be part of a journey that empowers, unites, and inspires. Visit our website and embrace a world of possibilities today. RoyalFalconFoundation.com.
There's that QR code for those who want to learn a little more. And we are live again with Dan Sanderson in the studio.
Right.
Quite interesting to have the opportunity to watch a pre-recorded show that we did a couple of weeks ago. So, Dan, thoughts?
Well, there's two burning questions. I didn't quite feel satisfied about the problematic point where Islam and the Abrahamic religions, or Judaism, where that started to splinter, right? Okay. I don't think I really got a good understanding of what that, and maybe you could share what your perspective. It's really, I'm completely not sure. Very, very naive on that front.
Well, is that coming from a place of a general kumbaya feeling of why can't we just all get along, or is it coming from a perspective of, well, these religions claim to be the same, but they're killing each other, so the claims seem to have no merit, or something else?
So yeah, this would actually go to the essence of what I would say would be something like the Holy Spirit within me, okay? Because I'm trying to understand this type of thing. There's this truth function that I'm sensing and I'm moving towards, and it's one of pure curiosity. Now, I have a consistency that the way I see the world, and you've brought it up before, and it kind of blankets the truth of the wisdom that you say, that we all see things, we all think we're right. And it's kind of, it's meant to jive you up a bit, right? In a way, and it's playful. But the wisdom beneath that is that there is something there, right? There is, we have the most incredible machines that we've ever, like our brain capacity and our function as a species is absolutely incredible. Absolutely incredible. So, the way I look at this is that.
Well, let me jump in. Hold continuing thought, because you've raised a couple of questions, and I love what Steve McLean commented on earlier. I'm going to take it out of time. He was maybe a prophetic comment when he said, "Men do not understand simple fact." We get in our own way, right? We have seemingly thoughts, egos, whatever, that keep us from accepting simple fact. We get in our own way. We do all think we're right? It's not just a glib statement. We would not believe what we believe if we didn't think we were right. It's almost like an axiom, right? Whatever I believe it's right, or I wouldn't believe it.
Yeah, and and then at aggregate, a very interesting, beautiful phenomenon happens, right? We were talking off the air before we turned on the show tonight.
Beautiful or horrifying, right? Let me unpack that, because I was going to say this earlier, and that is that the serpent in the Garden of Eden. I've said this before, but in this context, maybe it'll really stick. The serpent in the Garden of Eden grows up to be the dragon of the book of Revelation. It's quite a logical symbology that's consistent with the message of the Bible. But how does the serpent grow up into a dragon? Well, it's like Caleb said, that Christianity infected the Roman Empire from within. The serpent's whisperings take root.
Oh my,
and the aggregation of deceived people give power to the dragon. The dragon is the expression of political power.
That's really interesting. I got really
Cain killed Abel
Yeah.
under the influence of the serpent. The dragon breathes fire and wreaks havoc across the planet because of the political power granted to bad ideas.
How do you reconcile that serpent might not just be your conscience, that little daemon, right? In Greek, they say daemon.
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what it is.
Okay, so it's the force
whatever the
feed,
serpent
okay.
is. Whatever the serpent is, you know, at a single individual level, it can, you know, ruin a couple of lives. And at the political level, it can, you know, it can create the Holocaust. Now, the inverse is also true, and this is fascinating from what Caleb was talking about there. In listening to Caleb the second time, I understood more what he was saying as I was in the studio with him talking. I was, you know, perhaps too active in my own head and not really understanding what he was saying. But he was focused on Paul actually not addressing a message of personal salvation. Christianity, large parts of Christianity have focused on a message of personal salvation. Are you saved? And Caleb was saying, if that was all it was, just declare your faith, just profess to know Jesus, then the Bible could have been a short story. Right? Something or Other Publishing publishes anthologies with short stories, right? Limit of 3,000 words. The Bible needn't have been more than 3,000 words if that's all it was. Profess faith in a higher power, specifically named Jesus, who sacrificed himself for you.
Right, sign here.
And then you are personally saved. And Caleb was emphasizing that Paul's message was a national one and a universal one. He was talking about the salvation of the Jewish people as a whole. It's the inverse of the serpent and the dragon.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's when this is Licorice, the cat. It just jumped in my lap. When one person accepts Jesus, accepts the call to repentance, to crucify the old man and become reborn, to become a new creation, to be resurrected to a new life. When one person accepts that call, that person is transformed. But what Caleb was saying is it's not about that.
Not about the
God
person,
wanted under Jesus a people, a holy people. You know, this is in the Old Testament. I call you, under Moses, God said, to be a nation of kings and priests. A nation of kings and priests. Not individual salvation, not one king or one priest. He wanted a whole nation of kings and priests. So that the biblical message, the plan of God was to create a holy people, an aggregate, an antidote to the dragon, which is not one person. I mean, Jesus in the Bible overcame Satan, right? In the desert, tempted for 40 days and 40 nights, and fasted, and was taken up to the pinnacle of the temple, and Satan tempted him in these various ways, and Jesus said, Satan has no part in me. And then Jesus said, resist the devil and he will flee from you, giving each individual that power. But what was really being called for was for a nation of individuals, a whole kingdom of people to take up their cross, each one of us living that way. And so much so that the power of those doing good would overcome all sin and all tears and all evil and transform the entire society. So instead, this gets back to your question, instead what happened, and we talked about this, is the individuals didn't transform. The individuals, or not enough individuals, and at the aggregate, power structures arose within the religions that were, almost as bad as the thing they were trying to overcome. And the nation of kings and priests became a nation of arrogant people who were not following the teachings, but rather were establishing their own righteousness. I mean, Paul talked extensively in his explanation of what Jesus came to do, was to, move people away from a trust and faith in their own righteousness. That really is that message of faith in Jesus. Don't trust in your own righteousness. Confess your belief in Jesus, pick up your cross and follow him. I don't want to get into the theology of it, but it's my personal belief that no, it's not once saved, always saved. Professing your faith in Jesus isn't enough. I believe that what James said, you claim faith without works. I prove my faith through my works. I will show on a daily basis that I am carrying the cross of Jesus by my behavior, by my actions, by the things that I do, knowing that at any point I could stumble and toss that cross aside and say, I'm done with this, right? But a group of people consistently sacrificing themselves for the greater good is what Paul was calling for, what the whole message of the Bible is from Genesis to Revelation. A spiritual power of enough people to counteract the power of the dragon.
Interesting. And it makes sense, there's this idea of Paul actually speaking to the Greeks, I think, right, trying to convince them. And so you have a polytheistic culture, and they're not opposed to listen to strangers and this type of thing. The marketplace was something that
the agora, right? And
yeah.
he honored it, right? He honored it. He the famous story of the statue to the unknown God, and he said the Greeks worshipped the true God unknowingly. They literally called it the unknown God. He said, I perceive that you are very religious, and you've even, just in case they missed a God in all their worship, they had a statue, or they had an altar to the unknown God. It was an altar, right? So we're giving sacrifices to this God, that God, the other God, but just in case we missed one, here's a catch-all basket of the unknown God, right? So we can check that box too. Paul didn't ridicule them for that. He honored them. He used that as a bridge. And then he also said that those of you who are keeping the moral law without having received it by revelation are a law unto yourselves in a good way. And God will honor the fact that you keep the law, even though you're not professing to even believe in him.
The thing that I'm getting here, the vibe that I'm getting with what Paul brought to the Greeks was even the situation at the time. Caleb had explained that that Christianity infected the Romans kind of like a virus, and I was like wincing a little bit at that, because I don't want that to be it's kind of like we pick the wrong words sometimes, right? It has it should have like all the benevolent effects of a virus, right? Like it catches on. I mean, that's this idea of Christianity is kind of a gift, right? It's very poetic. But I guess if you look at the time period when Paul was basically
sorry, it's kind of interesting now. It just struck me, the coronavirus, right? Well, the coronavirus is the ring around the sun, and what Caleb was referring to was the actual sun being the virus.
Yes.
They were infected by the sun, not the corona of the sun.
Yeah, not the crown, not the king. But you could, it's interesting.
No, the corona is literally a faintly colored luminous ring or halo appearing to surround a celestial body when viewed through a haze or thin cloud, especially such a ring around the moon or the sun. Right. That's what the definition of corona is. It just clicked.
Yeah, and he's saying the virus is the sun, not the wow.
I don't think Caleb made that connection, but we did.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. But I want to start off by saying, so you're imagining this situation. Paul is taken up by the way the world is, right? Caleb says, go back to those and just trying to imagine those times. So I'm trying to imagine what it would be like to be Paul. And I think that if religion is revelatory, right? If things are progressing that means there's something, and I'll take you a little bit on the trajectory. There's something that the Socratic period of time did that was over and above better than the Homeric time, i.e. moving warriors into intellectual heroes. And then there's something beneficial that happens when Jesus is born. There's like a line drawn in the sand, and there's a crossing of the Rubicon. As a society, we are completely forever changed, right? This is a good definition of our hegemony.
Coming of age story, right? Humanity is coming of age over time.
Right. And the same way I explain about the Greeks, that we kind of tapped into, holy shit, we have an imagination, we can move to a perfected ideal. What did that manifest into? Well, God only knows. So basically, I think focusing on what was like, holy shit, look at this religion, it's so much different or better. What's unique about it? What's novel about it? And he must have been witness to the spread, the infectious spreading of Christianity at that time, right?
Who was witness to that?
Paul must have been.
Paul, yes and no. I mean, he began to see it, and he worked for it. But he also saw the problems and challenges, right? So what's interesting about the history of Paul is the thread of his story. Well, there are many interesting things, but there, in this context, there's a thread of his personal story where it's documented that he appealed to Caesar. Right? Do you know the story? So Paul was brought up on charges.
Really?
After his work in proclaiming Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd have to go back and research the specific details. I'm going from memory here, but and then he was thrown in jail. And then
I knew that.
He would have been released, but he appealed his case to Caesar, and he was later crucified in Rome. And I can't remember if it was he or Peter that was supposedly crucified upside down or whatever. But the point is, Paul was martyred, but there's a narrative in the New Testament that had he not appealed to Caesar, he would not have been martyred. And I've always read that in two ways. One, he was destined to be martyred, and in his martyrdom, he served the cause of God, right? But there's also part of me that thinks he thought he might achieve something for Jesus and then was mistaken. In other words, that he thought in his own time that by traveling to Rome, the cause might be furthered, and probably it was. He probably did,
maybe not in the way he imagined, right?
Or maybe he knew he was going to be crucified or whatever. But the fact that in the New Testament it says, had he not appealed to Caesar, he might. But he did anyway. He did anyway, whatever his reasons were. This is informed. This thought is informed by the fact that all of the disciples wrote, spoke, and acted as though Jesus was returning in their lifetime.
Yeah.
They expected him to come in their lifetime, and they're even saying, this generation shall not pass away. Jesus said, before all these things be fulfilled. So they thought his second coming was imminent.
It was the first great disappointment.
Yeah, exactly. And getting back to your original question that opened this segment about the religions disagreeing, we all have to create our narrative. We all have to create our story about our world and our circumstances and what makes sense. I read this very fascinating book years ago called Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain. and it's actually a book to help you with art, but it explained how the right side of your brain works versus the left, and how, you know, things come into your eyes and it's upside down, and it teaches you to start drawing things upside down and to activate the right side of the brain and all this. But anyway, it had this explanation of how our consciousness works by like this nagging question, who am I and how do I fit in? Where did I come from and where do I belong? These are like existential questions at the heart and soul of who we are as human beings. And our consciousness and our intellect is driven by the question and the hypothesis, the question and the hypothesis. And I saw this particularly with my son, Caleb, interestingly, not Caleb who we had on the show, but my son, Caleb, who as a young child, more so than my daughter, would voice and formulate his hypotheses around these things. And it was fascinating to me to hear his 2-year-old, his 3-year-old, his 4-year-old, his 5-year-old hypotheses around what made sense to him in the world, his explanations for things. He would come up with a fantastic logic to explain things that he saw or questions that he had. And some of them were just hilarious because they were just so bizarre and so illogical. And some of them illustrated this nascent, infantile, deep insight. And I just loved watching this unfold and grow and reaffirming the fact that, yes, we do that. We ask these questions and we formulate answers. And as we get older, these, you know, the layers and layers and layers of narrative that we build, you know, that saying, oh, what a tangled web we weave. The layers of intellect and answers to these questions and the narratives that we have spun in our heads to explain everything. Who can even diagram it out? Why or how we arrived at whatever conclusion of whatever belief we hold, you know, that the moon is made of green cheese, and why we believe that the moon is made of green cheese, and why we insist that the moon is made of green cheese, and why we're convinced that the moon is made of green cheese, and why we hate anyone who would tell us that the moon is not made of green cheese, and why we have to stop anyone who would spread the lie that the moon is not made of green cheese, because that is a damnable lie and it is destroying people's lives.
Yeah. And
we all have this about ourselves to varying degrees.
Is this the tribal definition?
And well, maybe, I don't know. I mean, I think it's beyond tribal. It's, you know, tribes would be people who have a commonality of narrative and belief, right? And so we find our tribe and identify with those who you know, believe that, no, the moon is not made of green cheese, it's made of Munster. You know, and somebody else, you know, it's made of Swiss cheese. You can see the holes. You know, people deny the holes in the moon, right? Yeah. They're the hole deniers, and it's most famously illustrated by that movie Life of Brian, which I've referred to many times, where Brian's running through the crowd and he's carrying a gourd and his sandal falls off, and he throws the gourd to somebody so he can run faster, and somebody else picks up the sandal, and now the sandal tribe and the gourd tribe are arguing with each other about who is the true holder of the sacred relic of the cult of Brian.
Yeah, exactly.
But we're like that. We are like that. And religious beliefs are very deep-seated, and that's why people think, well, we should get rid of religion. And somehow the problem would be solved. Well, we've seen how that works out. We will find something else to replace it. And whatever we pour into that vacuum is probably uglier than our misunderstanding of the divine revelation as delivered.
Yeah, in that sense, Wade, I'm definitely a traditionalist, right? I mean, that's the trajectory. I definitely want to study that. I want to see, for me, if I'm confused by the current news cycle, I'll go and read some philosophy. Then it's like, It all makes sense, right? Kind of get, and I think that's where, if you look at some of the even contemporary historians, like Yuval Noah Harari, his books are great, but the one he does about the current time, you're like, man, you see great way out, but you don't, it gets like almost infinitely more difficult to predict the unfolding. It's just, where's the humility? Where's the humility society? Okay, you look at the trajectory. You say one generation. How closely could they predict that 100, 200, 300 years later the world would look like it looked ever? Right? Unless maybe you're in Egypt, and it's the same thing for 5,000 years. Maybe. Okay, I get that. Right? But not in our society. We don't get to participate in society to that. We're not witnessing a society like that. We definitely don't have covenant with it, but we're witnessing it.
Well, I'm grateful to my professor of Latin literature and translation, Dr. Stavronidis. May God bless his soul and allow it to rest in peace. I'm sure he's looking down and smiling now, because he gave me an F in Latin literature and translation, and I was put on academic probation after one semester at Ambassador College. And the reason he gave me an F was because I basically fought against the idea that there was value in the classics. And I was, it was a senior level course. No, it was a senior level course. And I was a freshman, struggling with my own issues and my own narrative. I'm grasping at things that I needed to save me at that time. But I loved the man, even though he gave me an F. I enjoyed his class. I was just not qualified and competent at the time to deal with the material in the way he was teaching this senior level college course. When I'd come in as a delinquent freshman in my first semester, and the reason I ended up showing up late, and there were no classes left, and I had to take an elective that I would fill a requirement, and that filled the literature requirement. And it was the only class open, and I needed to have another countable election to my degree. And my academic advisor foolishly put me in there, saying, you're a smart kid, you've lived overseas, you speak a couple of languages, I'm sure you'll do fine in here. Well, no, he overestimated me.
Yeah.
Plus, they didn't really have any other option. So I ended up I got an F. It was the best thing that ever happened to me. And I've thought often about the lesson I was taught by that class and that man, even though I failed the class. It was a great lesson. And I've had more respect for what he was trying to do for me by helping broaden my mind and perspective from our very narrow theological focus that I had embraced as a way of getting my life straightened out, which was also equally important for me personally. But he saw the need to have an educated
wider look or
people
something.
in our fellowship. I mean, that's what we're trying to do on this show as well, in the name of religion, is help open up religious people to understand this broader perspective. But I still am a fundamentalist. I do believe that these words are revealed by God. And as you know, and as the listeners know, I believe that although these prophecies are difficult to understand, we can understand them in hindsight. So when Caleb said earlier in the show that when he started reading about the Bahá'í faith, it helped put Islam in perspective. And so it is that this perspective that even Islam has a role to play in the greater plan of God has helped me look at the world differently and understand the various events that are happening in a more holistic way. I'm not saying that the way that other people look at them is all wrong. I'm not saying that the way I look at them is all right, but I continue to evolve my thinking, and I've cast away a number of narratives over the last 15 years that objective reality has shown to be false. And you have to be open to the fact that when, the people that came back from the moon brought back dust instead of moldy cheese, that maybe your understanding of the moon being made of green cheese was incorrect. And that maybe when the scientific expedition comes back from the hot place with ice samples, all those things that you've said, well, hell would freeze over first before XYZ. When they come back with ice samples, you need to question your prior beliefs. And this would apply to every religion. And I would even submit it applies to the Baha'is in our audience as well, because we don't want to be found making the same mistake that the Jews made when Jesus came, or the Christians made when Muhammad came, and so on and so forth. We don't want to be throwing babies out with bathwater. We should be diligently studying the writings of these various religions and finding out what that rub is telling us. When things don't make sense, when they don't gel, we don't just say, well, ours is more recent and throw all that out, because it's the writings are holy, and our understanding is full of holes.
Yeah, very, very interesting. Yeah. So,
and I don't know if that fully unpacks your question. Well, why are these religions killing each other?
Well, I have one maybe theory that I could float out there. The Muslim faith seems to be, or could have been a response to the emerging Christianity religion, which, as it was emerging, there was something about the other culture that said it just doesn't represent us. And so in order to say, wait a minute, we want our version, it seems very like, kind of like a copycat in a way. It's kind of, it doesn't seem to me like it's revelatory. It may even have elements that it's going back to some more fundamentalist.
Well, let me
ideas,
throw a question back at you then. But first, I'll throw this back and remind me. It has to do with cultural relativism, right? But let's show this comment from Steve McLean. He's emphasizing the facts here that on the story about Paul. Paul was arrested in Jerusalem and sent to Caesarea for 2 years, but he wanted to be tried in Rome because he was a Roman citizen. Yes, he appealed to Rome because he could, right? He had that right, but he didn't have to, which was my point, right? And the statement is, he could have been saved had he not appealed to Rome. But because he called out his rights as a Roman citizen, that's why he ended up being martyred, according to that statement in the Bible. So my question was, why did he do that? Yes, he could. This is the factual reason as to why he could. He was a Roman citizen. But it didn't turn out well for him, and others knew that it wouldn't. So that's an open question. But thank you, Steve, for highlighting those facts. So throwing back the question at you, Dan, shouldn't we be open to question things about our culture? In other words, we might want a religion that's more culturally appropriate, right? There are those who would say that Christianity lost its way when, the mass conversions happened, and Christianity adapted and adopted its teachings and its practices to make it easier for the Gentiles to come into the church en masse, right? To have mass conversions without them having to change their behaviors and change their culture. So Christianity adapted itself to the culture versus making the culture adapt itself to Christianity. There's a yin yang there.
I get the yin yang of competing things, but I think in the infinite wisdom of God and what is good, I think that we do have to adapt and be progressive as, you know, your trajectory is taking you on is revelatory improvements. And I think that speaks exactly to what you're saying about the fact that we have to be able to look and critique our culture. This is how it slowly evolves, right? So basically then what it comes down to is, how do we want to live? And I think maybe one of the mistakes that we have as individuals is that as how we can project ourselves onto the platforms of political stages, okay? Because as you're explaining all of this, I'm still thinking 10 to 1, the work has to be done with individuals, introspection, try and cultivate your virtues. And if it doesn't happen from within, right, then we can't set up a monolithic umbrella to take the place of something that is just, it has to be, the seeds have to be planted. It has to be cultivated.
It must inspire, not coerce.
Right. So,
you know, the change must be internal, not outward. Or rather, it must be generated from within. It must not be imposed from the outside.
Can I say one thing about Israel?
It's a free country, at least here in America, but you're up in Canada. I don't know. Can you?
Yeah. And then I have to get going. But the thing about Israel is, I try and take both sides, and I'm having a real hard time in Palestine, a really difficult time, guys, honestly. But when I look at the response, the terrorist response that the state of Israel did on Gaza, I think to myself, is there anything?
Let's not go there. Let's not go there.
Okay. Goes in deep, doesn't it? Real fast.
You know, it's Pandora's box right now.
Yeah.
We have there are reasons why we on this show would not just get into it. Yeah. I want to steer clear of either of us causing problems for ourselves or others by talking about that specifically in terms of sides. Yeah. We didn't pick a comment.
A comment or a book winner, right? Got to give a book.
So,
winner.
I mean, there were several that have merit here. Let's see. There's one here from Ensign. Well, this is to provide a little historical context to that. Israel and Iran have been very close and friendly from 3,000 years ago. Even the Torah was completed by Ezra in Iran after they were freed from Babylon. So from time to time, there has been more favor, you might say, between some of these nations. I think in terms of prophecy, it does go way back to Abraham. It goes back to Jacob and Esau. It goes back to Isaac and Ishmael. In terms of the Bible, the peoples in the Middle East do stem originally from those, and it's still playing out today. And I would, without commenting on sides, we should be watching the events in Israel. We should be praying for them, and we should know and understand that God is working out a plan, and we should be reading the Holy Writings to understand what that plan is, and to reconcile these challenges between the Torah, the Gospel, and the Quran, the so-called Old Testament, the New Testament, and the Quran. There are all of these address the situation over there, and it would be interesting for individuals who want to know more about it to dig into the religious and the secular history of the region and get the facts for themselves.
Yeah.
So did you have any specific thoughts on what comment here should be picked?
I like the one within some regime, the one that you brought up about the history. I thought that was something about Ezra in Iran.
Yep.
After they were freed from Babylon. I didn't quite know what he was getting after, but I like the possibility that there were friendly before, or there was a period of time where there was a cultural respect, It seems so intractable.
I'll throw out another comment here just to emphasize the Baha'i position of no stated opinion on what goes on in the Holy Land, no matter how tragic it is. And I don't know that, I think it's that the Baha'i faith, the Baha'i world community will not state an opinion. Baha'is are entitled to hold opinions, right? But we don't get involved in expressing them. So we want to honor that on this show.
And the way she did that was very artfully well done too, right? Whichever way it goes, that's really interesting. It's not an opinion. That's not an opinion, is that? That's just a statement. No, but we'll, yeah, because that could go either way. That makes you think for a minute.
Yeah. So, but you would like to suggest, Ansan, I am not opposed to that at all. I think what we had told Caleb, though, is that these comments are available.
He was going to pick one too, right?
Yeah, these comments are available on YouTube. He will revisit and weigh in. Okay. So we are at the end of the show. We do not, unfortunately, have a time for Caleb to come back defined yet, but we will have him back. We're also going to have some other guests come back from the past, so you can look forward to them. But in the next few weeks, we have a series of new guests. Next week's guest is Marco Ciappelli, who is a journalist and a futurist. And he will be asking the question, is technology today's forbidden fruit? We've spent a lot of time in the Garden of Eden talking about that as a source of human history and the evolution of society. And Marco's going to be answering the question, is technology the latest version of that fruit? Is AI more like us than we think? Is it a mirror on our society or a force that is driving us forward? Is this progress, or are we heading towards a cliff? Join thought leader and futurist Marco Ciappelli for a compelling and insightful discussion on what the acceleration of technology reveals about society and where it's headed. And of course, we will also weave in religion, as we always do. So that's for next week. We will also, I guess, be announcing the winner. We'll also post the winner of this week's free book on the YouTube channel. So make sure to like, subscribe, share it with your friends. We do have a growing audience. We have some very exciting guests coming up as this show is growing in popularity. We're very, very grateful to all of you loyal fans who come and comment and listen and stay as we go on for 2 hours. There are quite a few still out there in the audience. We're very grateful for you. We hope you've enjoyed today's show. And we look forward to seeing you next week, same time, same place, with a fully live show. Although I did enjoy this, Dan. I think we may do more pre-recorded shows
yeah, it was fun.
Going forward.
Yeah.
Any last minute thoughts, Dan, before we sign off for the evening?
No, that's it.
All right. Stay tuned. Keep independently investigating, and we will continue to share our perspective on Created in the Image of God. See you next week, same time, same place. Goodbye.